Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 1, Chapter 12, The Battle in France, August 20 to September 6, 1914. For while the dagger gleamed on high, reeled soul and sense, reeled brain and eye. By Scott, The Lady of the Lake, Canto 5, 26. The opening was not only the first, but incomparably the greatest crisis of the war. From August 18 to the middle of September, all the best trained troops of the 7 warring states were continuously hurled against one another in open warfare, with ample ammunition, and in all the ardor of warlike inexperience arising from what, for most, had been a generation of peace. In this awful month, more divisions fought on more days, and more men were killed and wounded than in any whole year of the struggle. There were, in fact, 2 crises, one in the west and one in the east, each surpassing in scale and intensity anything subsequently endured, and each reacting reciprocally upon the other. There had arisen for Germany the long-foreseen and profoundly studied case of the war on 2 fronts. For this she had prepared the Schlieffen Plan. The main German effort was directed against France. More than 7/8 of the German armies was employed in the west. Out of 40 German army corps, less than 5 were left to defend the eastern provinces of Germany against the onslaught of the Russian Empire. The Schlieffen Plan staked everything upon the invasion of France and the destruction of the French armies by means of an enormous turning march through Belgium. In order to strengthen this movement by every means, General von Schlieffen was resolved to run all risks and make all sacrifices in every other quarter. He was prepared to let the Austrians bear the brunt of the Russian attack from the east, and to let all East Prussia be overrun by the Russian armies, even, if need be, to the Vistula. He was ready to have Alsace and Lorraine successfully invaded by the French. The violation and trampling down of Belgium, even if it forced England to declare war, was to him only a corollary of his main theme. In his conception, nothing could resist the advance of Germany from the north into the heart of France, and the consequent destruction of the French armies, together with the incidental capture of Paris and the final total defeat of France within 6 weeks. Nothing, as he saw it, would happen anywhere else in those 6 weeks to prevent this supreme event from dominating the problem and ending the war in victory. To this day, no one can say that the Schlieffen Plan was wrong. However, Schlieffen was dead. His successors on the German General Staff applied his plan faithfully, resolutely, solidly, but with certain reservations enjoined by prudence. These preservations were fatal. Moltke, the nephew of the great commander, assigned 20% more troops to the defense of the German eastern frontier and 20% less troops to the invasion of northern France than Schlieffen had prescribed. Confronted with the Russian invasion of East Prussia, he still further weakened the great right wheel into France. Thus, as will be seen, the Schlieffen Plan, applied at 4/5 of its intensity, just failed, and we survive to this day. We have seen how accurately General Wilson was able to forecast to the British cabinet in August 1911 the true German Schlieffen Plan, and how he measured almost exactly the number of German divisions which would be used in the great turning movement. I had throughout the greatest misgivings of an impulsive offensive by the French, based not on calm calculations of numbers, distances, and times, but upon the psychology of the French nation, the best traditions of the French army, the natural élan of the poilu. I knew, of course, that the offensive school held the dominance in France. One could see its reflection in the language of our military men, though these were strongly anchored to modern realities by unpleasant recollections of the Boer War. Without knowing with any certainty or exactness the French plan, I dreaded, whenever I reflected on the problem, an impetuous onset followed by a shattering shock. As between the two nations, France and Germany, it would be natural for the stronger to be left to take the offensive and invade the weaker. For our 5 marches from the frontier, the task of the invader becomes very difficult and may be made more difficult still. The defenders have superior communications from flank to flank and from front to rear. They fall back on carefully chosen, well-prepared positions and on ample magazines of munitions and supplies. The invader finds himself in a hostile country, surrounded by spies, with bridges and roads, especially lateral roads, broken and disorganized, and important junctions defended by fortresses still in the hands of the enemy. He is thus forced to deliver the first and great battle on ground selected and prepared by his opponent. It is surely at this moment, and after this first shock has been sustained under the best conditions, that the opportunity for the offensive energy of the weaker power presents itself. If the Germans invade France, it seemed to me in those days that the French would be wise to act as follows. They should entrench themselves conveniently along or near their frontier, constructing a vast system of field fortifications, open and concealed, sham and real, according to every device known at that time. And in these positions they should await the first shock of the Germans. I believed that the Germans did not appreciate the tremendous power of modern weapons, particularly the rifle. I based this on what I had seen of their methods in their maneuvers of 1906 and 1909, and on what I had learned about rifle fire in the South African War. The Germans were the challengers. They were the stronger, but not, in my opinion, strong enough for the continuous storming and reduction of well-fortified positions held by French regular armies or by British troops. I did not, of course, contemplate that the French would dig one uniform line along the whole length of their frontier. There would naturally treat the problem selectively, here resisting with their utmost strength, there allowing the enemy to penetrate and bulge into unpromising country or into some well-considered tactical area, only to be brought up by lines 15 to 20 miles in rear. They would not hesitate to sell the Germans piece by piece a certain amount of ground for disproportionate losses. The universal tactical object to be pursued in this first phase should be to force the Germans to expose themselves in the open to the rifle and artillery fire of well-trained Frenchmen. It would be reasonable to hope that a process of this kind, continued for 3 or 4 days along the whole front, would have resulted in far heavier losses to the Germans than to the French, and that a larger proportion of the German than of the French armies would have been deployed and extended. One hoped in this way to see the French take toll of the manhood of the German nation at the outset of the war, as the British army did on a small scale at Mons and La Cateau. This would in no way have excluded tactical action by means of counterattacks wherever opportunities presented themselves. Meanwhile, at least 2/5 of the French armies should have been held back in a great mass of maneuver, northeast of Paris. With this mass of maneuver, I hoped the British army would have been associated. This general disposition should not have been compromised by any effort to proceed to the relief of Belgium, except with cavalry and small detachments to encourage the Belgians and to gain time. I was, of course, firmly persuaded, in common with the British General Staff, that the main German encircling movement would take place through Belgium, and would comprise considerable forces west of the Belgian Meuse. I hoped that, if this movement eventuated and prolonged itself in great strength, the French would find an opportunity of using the greater part of their armies of maneuver against it after the Germans had been well punished along the whole front. At any rate, that is the sort of way in which I thought then, before the event, and think still the French command might best have safeguarded the vital interests of France. The accession of General Joffre to the chief command had led, however, to a complete recasting of the French ideas. Under the Joffre regime, the French General Staff had made a new plan of which they darkly nursed the secret. They called it Plan 17. The famous Plan 17 consisted in a general offensive in an easterly and northeasterly direction by 4 French armies, with the last remaining army in reserve behind their center. It was based upon an ardent faith that the French right would penetrate deeply into Alsace and Lorraine, and an obstinate disbelief that the French left would be turned by a German movement west of the Meuse through Belgium. Both these calculations were to be completely falsified by the first events of the war. From the very earliest days it was clear that the views which the British General Staff had consistently held since 1911 of a great German turning movement through Belgium, probably on both sides of the Belgian Meuse, were correct. Why should the Germans, with their eyes open, throw first Belgium and then the British Empire into the scales against them, unless for an operation of supreme magnitude? Besides, there were the evidences of their long preparations, camps, railways, and railway sidings, which the British staff, under Sir John French and Sir Henry Wilson, had so minutely studied. Lastly, reported with much accuracy from day to day, there came the enormous troop movements on the German right, towards and into Belgium on both sides of the Meuse. Before the end of the first week in August, General Lenrezac, the commander of the left French army, the 5th, was raising loud cries of warning and alarm about the menace to his left, and indeed his rear, if he carried out the role assigned to him and attacked as ordered in a northeasterly direction. By the end of the second week, the presence of the accumulating masses of the German right could no longer be denied by the French High Command, and certain measures, tardy and inadequate, were taken to cope with it. Nevertheless, after the raid of a corps and a cavalry division into Alsace on the 13th of August, General Joffre began his offensive into Lorraine, with the 2 armies of the French right, the center armies conforming a few days later. And up till the evening of the 18th, General Lenrezac and the left French army were still under orders to advance northeast. 3 days later, this same army was defending itself in full battle from an attack from the north and northwest. It had been compelled to make a complete left wheel. The Germans, as General Michael and Sir Henry Wilson had predicted 3 years before, made their vast turning movement through Belgium. They brought into action almost immediately 34 army corps, of which 13 or their equivalent were reserve formations. Of the 2 million men who marched to invade France and Belgium, 700,000 only were serving conscripts, and 1,300,000 were reservists. Against these, General Joffre could muster only 1,300,000, of whom also 700,000 were serving conscripts, but only 600,000 were reservists. 1,200,000 additional French reservists responded immediately to the national call, encumbering the depots without equipment, without arms, without cadres, without officers. In consequence, the Germans outnumbered the French at the outbreak by 3-2 along the whole line of battle, and as they economized the forces on their left, they were able to deliver the turning movement on their right in overwhelming strength. At Charleroi, they were 3-1. It was for the tactical sphere that General Joffre and his school of Young Turks, as they came to be called in France, had reserved their crowning mistakes. The French infantry marched to battle conspicuous on the landscape in blue breeches and red coats. Their artillery officers in black and gold were even more specially defined targets. The cavalry gloried in ludicrous armor. The doctrine of the offensive, raised to the height of a religious frenzy, animated all ranks, and in no rank was restricted by the foreknowledge of the modern rifle and machine gun. A cruel surprise lay before them. The battle began on the 20th, when the two armies of the French right advanced to the south of Metz. They were resisted on the front by strongly prepared German defenses and violently attacked upon their left by the Bavarian army issuing from the radial roads and railways of the fortress. The Third French Army, marching north towards Arlon, blundered into the Germans in the morning mist of August 22, 4 or 5 of its divisions having their hats shorn away while they were still close to their camping grounds. Everywhere along the battlefront, whenever Germans were seen, the signal was given to charge. Vive la France! À la baïonnette! En avant! And the brave troops, nobly led by their regimental officers, who sacrificed themselves in even greater proportion, responded in all the magnificent fighting fury for which the French nation has been traditionally renowned. Sometimes these hopeless onslaughts were delivered to the strains of the Marseillaise, 6, 7, or even 800 yards from the German positions. Though the Germans invaded, it was more often the French who attacked. Long swaths of red and blue corpses littered the stubble fields. The collision was general along the whole battlefront, and there was a universal recoil. In the mighty battle of the frontiers, the magnitude and terror of which is scarcely now known to British consciousness, more than 300,000 Frenchmen were killed, wounded, or made prisoners. These disasters heralded the enormous perils to which the French and British armies on the left or northern flank were now to be exposed. The Fifth French Army had no sooner completed with severe exertions its deployment on the Sambre, and the British army advancing by forced marches had no sooner reached the neighborhood of Mons, when the overwhelming force of the German turning movement through Belgium fell upon them. Both General Lanrezac and Sir John French were about to be launched in a vehement offensive, which the French headquarters believed would hurl back the wheeling German right. The British command accepted this guidance with implicit faith. Lanrezac, sure that Joffre was utterly adrift from facts, watched with insolent distrust the impending disaster. But even he never imagined the weight and sweep of the German enveloping swings. The two armies of the left only escaped disaster by the timely retreat which Lanrezac and Sir John French each executed independently and on his own initiative, and also by the most stubborn resistance and rifle fire of the highly trained professional British infantry. Many faults of temperament and indeed of loyalty to the British army on his left are urged against General Lanrezac. Nevertheless, his grasp of the situation and stern decision to retreat while the time remained has earned the gratitude of France. It was a pity he forgot to tell his British allies about it. The utmost secrecy had naturally been maintained by the French about their general plan. The existence of their nation was at stake. Neither the British cabinet nor what was left of the War Office were in a position to understand what was passing. I do not know how far Lord Kitchener was specially informed. I think it very improbable that he shared the secrets of the French headquarters to the extent of being able to measure what was happening on the front as a whole. If he shared them, he did not show it by any remark which escaped him. He knew, of course, all there was to be known about the situation of our own army, and a good deal about the forces contingent to it. As the shock drew near, Prince Louis and I felt it our duty at the Admiralty to free Lord Kitchener's hands in every respect and to bear to the full our burden of responsibility. I therefore wrote to him on the 22nd of August as follows. The Admiralty are confident of their ability to secure this country against invasion or any serious raid. If you wish to send the 6th Division abroad at once, we should not raise any objection from the naval standpoint. The situation now that both the Navy and the Territorials are mobilized and organized is entirely different from those which have been discussed in the Invasion Committee of the CID. Footnote, Committee of Imperial Defense. End of footnote. And if you want to send the last regular division, the First Sea Lord and I are quite ready to agree, and so far as possible to accept responsibility. He replied, "It is very doubtful if the division now crossing will get up in time to take part in the battle now impending on the Sambre. As soon as I can, I will let you know about the 6th Division going over. If I send it, we have practically nothing left." Late on the evening of August 23, I had a talk with Lord Kitchener. We knew the main battle had been joined and that our men had been fighting all day, but he had received no news. He was darkly hopeful. The map was produced. The dense massing of German divisions west of the Belgian Meuse and curling round the left flank of the Anglo-French line was visible as a broad effect. So was the pivot of Namur, in front of which this whole vast turning movement seemed precariously to be hinged. He had in his mind a great French counterstroke, a thrust at the shoulder, as it were, of the long, straining, encircling arm which should lop it off or cripple it fatally. He said of the Germans, "They are running a grave risk. No one can set limits to what a well-disciplined army can do. But if the French were able to cut in here," he made a vigorous arrow, northwest from Namur, "the Germans might easily have a Sedan of their own on a larger scale." I had a pleasing vision of the first phase of Austerlitz, with the Austrians stretching and spreading their left far out to the villages of Telnitz and Sokolnitz, while Napoleon remained crouched for his spring in the Pratzen Plateau. But had France a Napoleon? One had marched through Charleroi 99 years before. Was there another? And were the Germans like the Austrians and Russians of Austerlitz? However, we went anxiously but hopefully to our slumbers. At 7 o'clock the next morning I was sitting up in bed in Admiralty House, working at my boxes, when the door of my bedroom opened and Lord Kitchener appeared. These were the days before he took to uniform, and my recollection is that he had a bowler hat on his head, which he took off with a hand which also held a slip of paper. He paused in the doorway, and I knew in a flash, and before ever he spoke, that the event had gone wrong. Though his manner was quite calm, his face was different. I had the subconscious feeling that it was distorted and discolored as if it had been punched with a fist. His eyes rolled more than ever. His voice, too, was hoarse. He looked gigantic. "Bad news," he said heavily, and laid the slip of paper on my bed. I read the telegram. It was from Sir John French. My troops have been engaged all day with the enemy on a line roughly east and west through Morn. The attack was renewed after dark, but we held our ground tenaciously. I have just received a message from GOC 5th French Army that his troops have been driven back, that Namur has fallen, and that he is taking up a line from Maubeuge to Rocroi. I have therefore ordered a retirement to the line Valenciennes-Longueville-Maubeuge, which is being carried out now. It will prove a difficult operation if the enemy remains in contact. I remember our precise instructions as to method and direction of retirement if necessity arises. I think that immediate attention should be directed to the defense of Havre. I did not mind it much till I got to Namur. Namur fallen, Namur taken in a single day, although a French brigade had joined the Belgians in its defense. We were evidently in the presence of new facts and of a new standard of values. If strong fortresses were to melt like wisps of vapor in a morning sun, many judgments would have to be revised. The foundations of thought were quaking. As for the strategic position, it was clear that the encircling arm was not going to be hacked off at the shoulder, but would close in a crushing grip. Where would it stop? What of the naked channel ports, Dunkirk, Calais, Boulogne? "Fortify Havre," said Sir John French. One day's general battle and the sanguine advance and hoped-for counterstroke had been converted into "Fortify Havre." It will be difficult to withdraw the troops if the enemy remains in contact. A disquieting observation. I forget much of what passed between us, but the apparition of Kitchener, agonistes, in my doorway will dwell with me as long as I live. It was like seeing old John Bull on the rack. When I met the admirals later, at 10, they were deeply perturbed about these channel ports. They had never taken the War Office view of the superiority of the French army. They saw in this first decisive shock the confirmation of their misgivings. Someone suggested we should at any rate make sure of the Cotentin Peninsula as an ample place of arms, girt on 3 sides by the sea, from which the British armies of the future might proceed to the rescue of France. Fortify Havre indeed. Already we looked to Cherbourg and Saint-Nazaire. British Admiralty to French Admiralty, August 24, 1914. Admiralty think it most important to naval interests to defend Dunkirk, Calais and Boulogne as long as possible. We release Admiral Rouillet's armored cruiser squadron to cooperate in the land defenses of these 3 places. We will reinforce him, if necessary, with a battle squadron. French flotilla bases and naval stores at Calais and Boulogne can be transferred to Dover, and all preparations for that should be immediately worked out. We wish also to receive without delay French views about land defenses of Dunkirk, Boulogne, Calais and Havre, and what the military prospects are of holding on to all of them. We will, of course, assist in any way in our power. Lastly, we are considering shifting all military stores of British Expeditionary Force now at Boulogne to Cherbourg. We wish to know French views on the necessity for this as the result of the present battle becomes more clear. First Lord to Commander-in-Chief Grand Fleet, August 24, 1914. Personal. News from France is disappointing and serious results of battle cannot yet be measured, as it still continues over enormous front. I have had the telegrams about it repeated to you. We have not entered the business without resolve to see it through, and you may be assured that our action will be proportioned to the gravity of the need. I have absolute confidence in final result. No special action is required from you at present, but you should address your mind to a naval situation which may arise where Germans control Calais and French coasts, and what ought to be the position of Grand Fleet in that event. I had not seen the Chancellor of the Exchequer except at cabinets since the fateful Sunday before the war. I had been buried in the Admiralty and he in the Treasury. I sustained vague general impressions of the tremendous financial crisis, panic, bankruptcies, suspension of the Bank Act, moratoriums, paper money, like a distant tumult. I realized that he, aided by the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Reading, was riding the storm and regaining effective control of events. But I did not attempt to follow and appreciate the remarkable sequence of decisions by which an unprecedented, unimaginable situation was met. Now, however, with this fateful news, I felt intensely the need of contact with him, and I wanted to know how it would strike him and how he would face it. So I walked across the Horse Guards Parade and made my way to the tunnel entrance of the Treasury Board room. It must have been about 10 o'clock in the morning, and as I opened the door, I saw the room was crowded. One of that endless series of conferences with all the great business and financial authorities of Britain, by means of which the corner was turned, was in progress. He saw me at once. I beckoned with my finger, and he came out. We went into a little room scarcely bigger than a cupboard, which adjoined, and I told him what had happened. I was relieved and overjoyed at his response. He was once again the Lloyd George of Agadir. Not since the morning of the Mansion House speech 3 years before had I seen him so strong and resolute for our country or so sure of its might. First Lord to Commander-in-Chief Grand Fleet, August 25, 1914. British retirement on French frontier successfully and skillfully effected. Army now in strong position, well supported. Our casualties reported not severe considering continued engagement with 2 German corps and 2 cavalry divisions. Enemy was well punished and lost heavily. Main battle has still to be fought. General impression better this morning. Hope all is well with you. Then came the days of retreat. We saw that the French armies of the right were holding their own, but all the centre and left was marching southwards towards Paris as fast as possible, while our own 5 divisions were for several days plainly in the very jaws of destruction. Footnote: the 4th Division, 5th in order of embarkation, arrived on the field at the beginning of the Battle of Les Cateaux. End of footnote. At the Admiralty we received requests to shift the base of the whole army from Havre to Saint-Nazaire, and with this complicated business we had to cope. The process of retreat continued day after day. A seemingly irresistible compulsion was pressing and forcing backwards the brave armies of France. Why should it stop? Would they ever be able to turn? If France could not save herself, nothing could save her. Casting about for help in this bitter time, I ventured to make the suggestion which follow. But it was not found possible, in view of all the difficulties, to give effect to them. Mr. Churchill to Lord Kitchener, August 28, 1914. Here is an idea which deserves examination. The Siberian troops would, if used against Germany and Austria, have to come south at an awkward moment and derange the communications, so I am told. On the other hand, it would probably be easy to send them to Archangel, and it is roughly only 6 days from Archangel to Ostend. If a couple of Russian corps d'armée were transported round this route, it would be possible to strike at the German communications in a very effective manner. It is an interesting idea, though I dare say it would not greatly commend itself to the Russians. Don't trouble to answer. To Prime Minister Sir Edward Grey, Lord Kitchener, September 5, 1914. I hear from many sources of the keen and widespread desire of individual Americans to take part in the war on our side. It has been stated that 50,000 or 60,000 Americans have volunteered, including a number of Virginians. I also hear that wealthy Americans are anxious to subscribe to the equipment of a force. There is no doubt that a large number of American citizens of quality and character are anxious to fight on our side. The value and advantage of such aid cannot be overrated from any point of view. I am ignorant of the law on these subjects, but foreign legions have played their part in many wars. It ought to be possible to organize in Canada an American volunteer force amounting to at least a division, which could go into action as such. Nothing will bring American sympathy along with us so much as American blood shed in the field. What is wanted now is that there should be an announcement made that we will accept the services of Americans who come to Canada or England and volunteer, that they will be formed into units in which they can serve together with their friends and comrades, that they will be able to choose their own regimental officers, that the British government will bear the whole expense of equipment and transportation, and that they shall share in every way the perils and fortunes of our troops. I believe there is a source of fighting manhood here in the highest possible quality, whose very employment would produce beneficial reactions in every direction. The problem is how to send up the rallying flag in Canada, and so indicate where those who wish to help us can go to join. Winston S. Churchill. Personally, I was hopeful that the wave of invasion would spend its fury, and as I had indicated in my memorandum of 3 years before, I believed that if the French forces had not been squandered by precipitate action on the frontiers, an opportunity of striking the decisive blow would occur about the 40th day. In order to encourage my colleagues, I reprinted this memorandum and circulated it to the whole cabinet on September 2, pointing out that I had never counted upon a victorious issue at the frontiers, had always expected that the French armies would be driven into retreat by the 20th day, but that, in spite of this, there were good hopes of success. But I had no means of measuring the forces by which this result would be achieved, except by the most general processes. Meanwhile, the impression of an overwhelming disaster was conveyed to England through 100 channels. Newspaper correspondents made their way in the confusion to the very fringe of the German advance. Stragglers by the thousand and even detachments of the British Army appeared in a desperate condition behind it and far out on its flanks. In spite of the censorship, the reports in the papers were alarming, while rumor much exceeded anything that was printed. Acute distress was manifested. In these circumstances, at the request of Lord Kitchener and the Prime Minister, I drafted on Sunday, September 4, the following communiqué, which was universally accepted as coming from the army, and I hope and believe gave comfort without concealing the truth. It is now possible to make another general survey in continuation of that issued on August 30. Of the operation of the British Army during the last week. No new main trial of strength has taken place. There have indeed been battles in various parts of the immense front, which in other wars would have been considered operations of the first magnitude, but in this war they are merely the incidents of the strategic withdrawal and contraction of the Allied forces necessitated by the initial shock on the frontiers and in Belgium, and by the enormous strength which the Germans have thrown into the Western theatre while suffering heavily through weakness in the Eastern. The British Expeditionary Army has conformed to the general movement of the French forces and acted in harmony with the strategic conceptions of the French General Staff. Since the battle at Cambrai, Les Cateaux, on August 26, where the British troops successfully guarded the left flank of the whole line of French armies from a deadly turning attack supported by enormous force, the 7th French Army has come into operation on our left, and this, in conjunction with the 5th Army on our right, has greatly taken the strain and pressure of our men. Footnote, actually called the 6th Army. End of footnote. The 5th French Army, in particular on August 29, advanced from the line of the Oise River to meet and counter the German forward movement, and a considerable battle developed to the south of Guise. In this, the 5th French Army gained a marked and solid success, driving back with heavy losses and disorder 3 German army corps, the 10th, the Guard, and the Reserve Corps. It is believed that the commander of the 10th German Corps was among those killed. In spite of this success, however, and all the benefits which flowed from it, the general retirement to the south continued, and the German armies, seeking persistently after the British troops, remained in practically continuous contact with our rearguards. On August 30 and 31, the British covering and delaying troops were frequently engaged. And on September 1, a very vigorous effort was made by the Germans, which brought about a sharp action in the neighborhood of Compiègne. This action was fought principally by the 1st British Cavalry Brigade and the 4th Guards Brigade, and was entirely satisfactory to the British. The German attack, which was most strongly pressed, was not brought to a standstill until much slaughter had been inflicted upon them and until 10 German guns had been captured. The brunt of this creditable affair fell upon the Guards Brigade, who lost in killed and wounded about 300 men. Footnote. In fact, however, it was the 1st Middlesex, 19th Infantry Brigade attached to the 4th Division, who captured the guns at Néry, the Guards being miles away at Villers-Cotterêts. End of footnote. After this engagement, our troops were no longer molested. Wednesday, September 2, was the first quiet day they had had since the Battle of Mons on August 23. During the whole of this period, marching and fighting had been continuous, and in the whole period the British casualties had amounted, according to the latest estimates, to about 15,000 officers and men. The fighting having been in open order upon a wide front, with repeated retirements, has led to a large number of officers and men, and even small parties, missing their way and getting separated. And it is known that a very considerable number of those who included in the total will rejoin the colors safely. These losses, though heavy in so small a force, have in no wise affected the spirit of the troops. They do not amount to a third of the losses inflicted by the British force upon the enemy, and the sacrifice required of the army has not been out of proportion to its military achievements. In all, drafts amounting to 19,000 men have reached our army or are approaching them on the line of communications, and advantage is being taken of the 5 quiet days that have passed since the action of September 1 to fill up the gaps and refit and consolidate the units. The British Army is now south of the Marne, and is in line with the French forces on the right and left. The latest information about the enemy is that they are neglecting Paris and are marching in a southeasterly direction towards the Marne and towards the left and center of the French line. The 1st German Army is reported to be between La Ferté-sous-Jouarre and Essis-Villefort. The 2nd German Army, after taking Rheims, has advanced to Château-Thierry and to the east of that place. Footnote. The 3rd Army took Rheims and were bombarded in the town by the 2nd Army. End of footnote. The 4th German Army is reported to be marching south on the west of the Argonne between Suippes and Ville-sur-Tourpe. All these points were reached by the Germans on September 3. The 7th German Army has been repulsed by a French corps near Denville. It would therefore appear that the enveloping movement upon the Anglo-French left flank has been abandoned by the Germans, either because it is no longer practicable to continue such a great extension, or because the alternative of a direct attack upon the Allied line is preferred. Whether this change of plan by the Germans is voluntary or whatever it has been enforced upon them by the strategic situation and the great strength of the Allied armies in their front will be revealed by the course of events. There is no doubt whatever that our men have established a personal ascendancy over the Germans, and that they are conscious of the fact that with anything like even numbers the result would not be doubtful. At this time I knew, of course, that another supreme battle was impending. My principal fear was that the French would turn too soon and make their new effort before the German thrust had reached its full extension. I was glad, therefore, to learn on September 3 that the French government were quitting Paris, as it showed a resolve to treat the capital just as if it were an ordinary tactical feature to be fought round or through as might be convenient in a purely military sense. It also showed a determination to continue the war, whatever might happen to Paris. We were now at the 35th day of mobilization. The Germans must be strung out in their pursuit and far ahead of supplies, munitions, and drafts. The great mass of Paris, with its circle of force, must either, like a breakwater, divide the oncoming German waves, or, by compelling them to pass wholly to the east of it, serve as a secure flank for the French. And at this culminating moment, the Russian pressure began to produce substantial effects. Honor must ever be done to the Tsar and Russian nation for the noble ardor and loyalty with which they hurled themselves into the war. A purely Russian treatment of their military problem would have led the Russian armies into immediate withdrawals from their frontiers until the whole of their vast mobilization was completed. Instead of this, they added to a forward mobilization an impetuous advance not only against Austria, but into Germany. The flower of the Russian army was soon to be cut down in enormous and fearful battles in East Prussia. But the results of their invasion were gathered at the decisive point. The nerve of the German headquarters failed. On August 25, 2 army corps and a cavalry division of the German right were withdrawn from France. On August 31, Lord Kitchener was able to telegraph to Sir John French, 32 trains of German troops were yesterday reported moving from the western field to meet the Russians. What had happened in the east? The Russians had invaded East Prussia with their 2 converging northern armies, one under Rennenkampf, marching from Vilna along the Baltic shore, the other under Samsonov, striking upwards from Warsaw. The defense of East Prussia had been confided to General von Prittwitz, who, with an army of about 5½ corps, had to meet a double attack of 2 armies, each the equal of his own. Prittwitz had advanced to arrest Rennenkampf near the eastern frontier and on August 20 began to fight the Battle of Gumbinen. The day was indecisive, although the superior qualities of the Germans were apparent. In the evening, Prittwitz, alarmed by the advance of the Warsaw army, which threatened his line of retreat, broke off the Battle of Gumbinen and telephoned to Moltke at the German main headquarters at Luxembourg that in the face of the overpowering Russian masses he must retreat to the Vistula, and that in view of the low state of the river he could not even guarantee to hold this line. His agitated manner emphasized his grave tidings. Moltke, when he hung up the receiver, determined there and then to supersede him. Telegrams were dispatched to a major general named Ludendorff, a high staff officer, who had distinguished himself in the capture of Liège, and to General von Hindenburg, a retired commander of massive qualities, to defend the German hearths and homes in East Prussia. Moltke further urged the Austrian commander-in-chief, Konrad von Hötzendorf, to hasten the offensive in the Austrian army in order to relieve the perilous situation in East Prussia. Hötzendorf thereupon, with many misgivings and without his whole strength, advanced to meet the vast tide of Russian invasion and was defeated a week later in the 200-mile battle called Lemberg. Ludendorff and Hindenburg hastened to East Prussia, where they found the situation largely restored by the unerring decisions of Prittwitz's brilliant staff officer, General Hoffmann. They arrived to find all the movements in progress which 5 days later were to result in the awful Battle of Tannenberg. The night of August 25 brought a solid assurance of victory to the German High Command. From every part of the intense battlefront in the west, the news was good. Everywhere the French had failed in their advances or were retreating. It was at this moment that Moltke felt able to cope with the anxieties which had oppressed him since, 5 days earlier, he had received Prittwitz's panic-stricken telephone message about Gumbinnen. Believing that the decision in France had been reached and that the supreme clash of armies was now bound speedily to end in favor of Germany, Moltke turned his eyes eastward. All Germany was in uproar about the invasion of East Prussia. The Emperor was indignant at this violation of our lovely Masurian lakes. Now is the time to send reinforcements to the east. Tappen, head of the operations branch, is told to make plans for transferring thither 6 army corps from the west, 2 from each of the right, center, and left. However, it is better not to promise more than you can give. 4 of the corps are at the moment closely engaged in action or pursuit. There are only 2 which seem immediately available. These 2 are upon the wheeling German right. In the profound design of the German war plans, these 2 corps had been reserved for the siege of Namur, and they had crossed the Belgian frontier, banked up behind Billow's advancing army. But now there was no siege of Namur. It had fallen almost at the first salvos of the heavy howitzers. It was already in German hands, and the 2 corps which were to have made the siege were, so it seemed, free. Give them, anyhow, to Ludendorff at Marienburg. The others can go later. So Tappen clears the line, and Ludendorff, on the eve of Tannenberg, a prey to all its measureless uncertainties, is offered immediately 2 of the best German corps, including 1 regular Guards division. Such an offer was a temptation to any general. It was a peculiar temptation to a man of Ludendorff's temperament. But curiously enough, a temptation against which his high intellectuality and commanding view afforded him adequate protection. Although he was fighting in East Prussia for everything he cared for, including, not negligible, his own power and importance, he still retained his trained view of the general situation. Of course, he said, he would like to have the corps, but they could not arrive in time for the impending battle in the east, and anyhow the situation in the west ought not to be endangered on his account. Several notable deeds have been inscribed upon Ludendorff's record, which have faded or even been expunged. Here is one which will endure a long time. However, the decision is Moltke's, and the 2 corps situated at the very thong of the German right-handed stroke, placed in the exact position where they could have followed so easily the marches of the armies and advanced to fill any gap which might open between them, are already being entrained with magnificent German efficiency for their 700-mile journey to the Vistula. During the whole of the next week everything continued to go well with Germany. all her armies in France strode forward on the heels of the retreating French and British as fast as men could march. And from the east arrived the dazzling news of Tannenberg. The Emperor was in what the German staff has described as a shout hurrah mood. Sure that not only victory but escape from war was in his grasp, he urged on his commanders, who in their turn hallured their troops. But Moltke's outlook seems to have undergone a change. The stubborn and unexpected French resistance of Lannesac's army at Guise, the bloody repulse which the Bavarians had received when they in their turn attacked the French fortress lines before Nancy, the fact that Kluck had found himself in contact with an unexpectedly substantial British army, which, though retiring before his masses, had at Mons, Les Cateaux, Néry, and Villers-Cotterêts not only inflicted much slaughter, but produced a formidable military impression on the German General Staff mind. All these added to the increasing distance of the German columns from their railheads, mingled a dark and broadening streak of misgivings with the general rejoicings. "Are these enemy armies really defeated?" asked the anxious chief of the German General Staff. "Is the battle over? Where are the prisoners? Where are the captured guns? Where is the disorganization?" In fact, as August ticked out its last crimson minutes, the most anxious man in Germany was the man who knew the most. Meanwhile, what of Joffre? We have no record of the reactions produced in the minds of the so-called Young Turks, who formed his entourage, and walled him in from the principal commanders, of the perfect failure and frustration of all their plans. But we do know that Joffre preserved a calm, impassive, and resolute demeanor, and rested for a while, like George II at the Battle of Dettingen. Sans peur et sans avis. Obviously something must be done to stem the enveloping German right wheel. Accordingly, on the 25th, when the results of the battles of the frontier were apparent, the following instruction number 2 was issued from General Headquarters. It having proved impossible to execute the offensive maneuver projected, further operations will be arranged in such a manner as to constitute on our left, by the junction of the 4th and 5th Armies, the British Army, and new forces drawn from the east, a mass capable of resuming the offensive, while the other armies restrain the efforts of the enemy for the present. In pursuance of this, a new French army, the 6th, under General Montnory, an officer of high quality, soon afterwards to be blinded by a bullet, began during the last 5 days to form around Amiens. The troops composing it were transported swiftly by railway from the eastern fortress line, where the armies of Dubé, Castelnau, and, we must in justice add, Sarray, had begun for the first time to discover and reveal the power of modern weapons when used from trenches. But now observe the intrusion of politics into the military sphere. Hitherto Joffre and his circle have had that unfettered discretion which great captains have only enjoyed when they were kings or emperors. But the crash on the frontiers has given a dismal stimulus to the civil power. On this same 25th of August, the French Minister of War, Massimy, himself a military man but turned politician, sent an officer to Joffre's headquarters with the following order: "If victory does not crown the success of our armies, and if these armies are reduced to retreat, an army of at least 3 active corps should be directed upon the entrenched camp of Paris to secure its protection." Monsieur Massimy gave in the war abundant proofs of courage and decision, both as deputy and soldier. But in this case he had behind him a far greater figure. In fact, it is the purpose of this account to suggest that General Gallieni, newly appointed military governor of Paris and holding commission as contingent successor to General Joffre, will be found the savior of France. The Young Turks were disgusted at this intervention, and we may suppose that they took care that the emergence of Gallieni, the potential successor at the head of important forces in the capital city, was not lost upon General Joffre. But the order was imperative. Massimy, about to be replaced almost in a few hours by a new minister, wielded a constitutional authority, the traditions of which were founded by the Jacobin Committee of Public Safety in the ferocious days of 1793. So Joffre and his staff had to find the troops, and where were they to be procured? No more can be taken from the eastern fortress lines. Assuredly none can be withdrawn from the line of armies retreating from the north. Well, there is this army of Montnory, which we should have liked to assemble on the left flank, a mixed lot, some shattered regulars, some reserve divisions mauled in their first unsuccessful action. If we have to lock up an army in Paris, if the government insists upon it, theirs shall be the responsibility, and these shall be the troops. However, no sooner had Montnory's army begun to gather round Amiens than it was forced to conform to the general retirement. The blind force of events decreed that it should be directed on Paris, there to become the sword of Gallieni. I may now be permitted to descend to a small scale of events, and to refer to an incident which has caused both stir and controversy. By August 27 the cabinet had formed the opinion that great friction had arisen between Sir John French and General Lenbrezac, and also between the British and French headquarters. Actually, the difference was with General Lenbrezac, who Sir John French considered had not given him due notice of his intention to retire after the battle of the 22nd and 23rd. We were concerned with the apparent intention of the British army to retire and refit behind the French left. Their losses, so far reported to us, did not exceed 10,000 men. We could not measure the exhaustion of the troops nor the extent of the disorganization inseparable from continued fighting and retreating. We accordingly decided to send Lord Kitchener at once to see the British and French commanders-in-chief and make sure that nothing that Britain could do should be left undone. If Lord Kitchener had gone in plain clothes, no difficulty would have arisen, but his appearance in Paris in the uniform of a field marshal senior to the commander-in-chief at that dark and critical moment wounded and disconcerted Sir John French deeply and not unnaturally. I labored my utmost to put this right and to make it clear that the Cabinet and Lord Kitchener were responsible. From Admiralty, September 4, 1914. Mr. Churchill to Sir John French. I have wanted so much to write to you and yet not to bother you with reading letters. Still, I suppose there are moments when you can find the leisure to read a few lines from a friend. The Cabinet was bewildered by your telegram proposing to retire from the line, coming on the top of a casualty list of 6,000, and your reports as to the good spirit of the troops. We feared that you and Joffre might have quarrelled, or that something had happened to the army of which we had not been informed. In these circumstances telegraphing was useless, and a personal consultation was indispensable if further misunderstandings were to be avoided. I am sure it would be wise to have some good officer on your staff like, say, Major Swinton, who could, without troubling you unduly, give us a clear and complete impression of what is taking place day by day. Our only wish is to sustain and support you. We are at a point where losses will only rouse still further the spirit of the nation, provided they are incurred, as yours have been, in brilliant and successful action. But we ought to be kept in a position to form a true and connected impression of the course of events. For my own part, I am only anxious that you shall be sustained and reinforced in every way, and I look forward confidently to seeing you here long at the head of 250,000 men, and in the spring of 500,000. I enclose you a paper which I wrote 3 years ago, which seems to have been borne out by the course of events, and which I hope will continue to be confirmed. In case any further difficulties arise, and you think I can be of any use, you have only to send for me, and, subject to the naval situation, I could reach you very quickly by motor car or aeroplane. It is hard sitting here day after day with so many friends engaged. The resolution of the nation is splendid. It is a different country to the one you left. God guard you and prosper your arms. From France, September 6, 1914, Sir John French to Mr. Churchill. Thank you very much for your kind and encouraging letter. It was a keen pleasure to hear from you and to read your words. I have had a terrible anxious time, and the troops have suffered severely, but they are simply glorious. I think you have heard me say that I would be ready to take on any enemy in Europe half as strong again. I say that more than ever now. I can't find words to say all I think of them. There has been some extraordinary misunderstanding at home as to my relations with General Joffre, the French commander-in-chief. We have been on the very best terms all through, and he has spoken most kindly of the help he has received from us. I can't understand what brought Kitchener to Paris. I am writing to you as one of my greatest friends, and I know you'll let me write freely and privately. His visit was really most unfortunate. He took me away from the front to visit him in Paris on a very critical day when I should have been directing the operation most carefully. And I tell you between ourselves strictly that when I returned to my headquarters I found a very critical situation existing at 8 p.m., and authoritative orders and directions badly needed. It was the day when the Guards and the Cavalry Brigade were so heavily engaged. I beg of you, my dear friend, to add one more to all the many great kindnesses you have done me, and stop this interference with field operations. In reply, I sent further explanations, which, aided as they were by victory, proved acceptable. From General Headquarters, British Forces, September 10, 1914. Sir John French to Mr. Churchill. Thank you, my dear friend, with all my heart for your truly kind reply to my letter, and also for your previous letter of the 4th. I fear I was a little unreasonable about K. and his visit. But we have been through a hard time, and perhaps my temper isn't made any better by it. However, as usual, you have poured balm into my wounds, although they may have been only imaginary, and I am deeply grateful. Since I wrote to you last, the whole atmosphere has changed, and for 5 solid days we have been pursuing instead of pursued, and the Germans have had simply hell. This very day we have captured several hundred, cut off a whole lot of transport, and got 10 or 12 guns, and the ground is strewn with dead and wounded Germans. Something like this happened yesterday and the day before, but this is nothing to what they have lost in front of the 5th and 6th French armies, which have been much more strongly opposed. They are indeed fairly on the run, and we are following hard. What a wonderful forecast you made in 1911. I don't remember the paper, but it has turned out almost as you said. I have shown it to a few of my staff. I was afraid of Joffre's strategy at first, and thought he ought to have taken the offensive much sooner, but he was quite right. I felt it vitally important to my whole structure of thought on this war problem to see for myself with my own eyes what was passing at the front and what were the conditions of this new war, and to have personal contact with Sir John French. Reflection and imagination can only build truly when they are checked point by discrete impressions of reality. I believed myself sufficiently instructed to derive an immense refreshment of judgment from personal investigation without incurring the opposite danger of a distorted view through particular experiences. But it was not until the armies came to a standstill along the line of the Aisne that I felt justified in asking Lord Kitchener to allow me to accept the repeated invitations of Sir John French. He gladly gave his permission, and I started the next morning. On September 16, the Duke of Westminster drove me from Calais to the British headquarters at La Fère en Tardenois. He made a fairly wide detour, as we had no exact information as to where the flanks of the moving armies actually lay, and it was not until nightfall that we fell in with the left flank of the British line. Sir John had all his arrangements ready made for me, and the next day between daylight and dark I was able to traverse the entire British artillery front from the edge of the Craonne Plateau on the right to the outskirts of Soissons on the left. I met everybody I wanted to meet and saw everything that could be seen without unnecessary danger. I lunched with the Greys, then commanded by that fine soldier Colonel Bulkeley Johnson. I had a long talk with Sir Henry Rawlinson on a haystack from which we could observe the fire of the French artillery near Soissons. I saw for the first time what then seemed the prodigy of a British aeroplane threading its way among the smoke puffs of searching shells. I saw the big black German shells, the coal boxes, and Jack Johnsons, as they were then called, bursting in Passy village or among our patient, impassive batteries on the ridge. I climbed to a wooded height beneath which the death-haunted bridge across the Aisne was visible. When darkness fell, I saw the horizon lighted with the quick flashing of the cannonade. Such scenes were afterwards to become commonplace, but their first aspect was thrilling. I dined with the young officers of the headquarters staff and met there, for the last time, alas, my brilliant, gallant friend, Hugh Dawnay. Early next morning I opened with Sir John French the principal business I had to discuss, namely the advantage of disengaging the British army from its position on the Aisne and its transportation to its natural station on the sea flank in contact with the navy. I found the Field Marshal in the most complete accord, and I undertook to lay his views before Lord Kitchener and the Prime Minister, who I knew would welcome such a development. I started home immediately and reached London the next morning. Contact with the army was always a great encouragement to everyone who visited France. In the field, in spite of the newly dug graves and hurrying ambulances, there was not the same sense of tragedy as hung around our windows in Whitehall. But I could not share the universal optimism of the staff. It was firmly believed and loudly declared on every side that if all available reinforcements in officers and men were sent to the army without delay, the war would be finished by Christmas. Fierce were the reproaches that the War Office were withholding vitally needed officers, instructors, and materials for the purpose of training vast armies that would never be ready in time. I combated these views to the best of my ability, being fully convinced of Lord Kitchener's commanding foresight and wisdom in resisting the temptation to meet the famine of the moment by devouring the seed corn of the future. I repeated the memorable words he had used to the cabinet, that The British Empire must participate in the land war on the greatest scale, and that in no other way could victory be won. Taking a complete survey, I consider now that this prudent withholding from the army in the field, in the face of every appeal and demand, the key man who alone could make the new armies, was the greatest of the services which Lord Kitchener rendered to the nation at this time, and it was a service which no one of lesser authority than he could have performed.